In 1994, the most celebrated gunmaker in British history was sold. Not to a rival, not to a defense conglomerate, not to the British government, to a Swiss luxury group whose other assets included Cartier jewelry, Montblanc pens, and IWC watches. The South Audley Street address did not change. The waiting list, running to 3 years for a new commission, did not shorten. The craftsmen did not leave their benches. A lock filer who had spent 30 years fitting side locks by hand in the Mayfair workshop arrived the following Monday and did precisely what he had done the Monday before. Nothing changed. And everything had changed. Because on the day the Richemont Group completed its acquisition of James Purdey Sons, the question of who owns British gun-making heritage and what that ownership means acquired an answer that no one in the London trade had anticipated, and that no one has fully resolved since. But the real story of Purdey is not the sale of 1994. It is the story of a gunmaker's apprentice from Marylebone who walked out of Joseph Manton's workshop in 1814 with a set of skills, a reputation he had not yet earned, and a conviction that the finest shotgun ever made had not yet been built, and that he was the man to build it. James Purdey was born in 1784 in Marylebone, then a parish on the northern edge of London where the city gave way to market gardens and coaching roads. His father, James Purdey the elder, worked as a gunmaker's assistant in the London trade, not a master, not a patentee, but a craftsman who understood the difference between a gun that passed proof and a gun that was worth carrying. That distinction, absorbed in childhood, would define the son's entire working life. At the age of 16, Purdey entered the workshop of Thomas Hutchinson, a London stocker whose work supplied several of the trade's more prominent names. Stocking, the fitting and shaping of the wooden stock to the metal action, was among the most demanding disciplines in the gun trade. A poorly fitted stock transferred recoil unpredictably, fatigued the shooter, and, in a fowling piece designed for a full day on a driven shoot, the difference between a well-stocked gun and a carelessly stocked one was felt in the shoulder by mid-morning. Purdey learned this with his hands before he understood it as a principle. From Hutchinson's workshop, he moved to the premises of the most consequential gunmaker then working in London, Joseph Manton of Davies Street, Mayfair. Manton was, by the first decade of the 19th century, the dominant figure in the London best gun trade, a maker of flintlock fowling pieces whose mechanical refinements, including improvements to the elevated rib and the gravitating stop, had set the standard by which every serious London gun maker measured himself. To work under Manton was not merely an apprenticeship, it was an education in what the London trade could produce at its absolute ceiling. Purdey spent several years at Manton's bench. He learned barrel work, action fitting, and, critically, the management of the customer relationship that defined the London best gun trade. A best gun was never a catalogue item. It was built to the individual, to the shooter's length of pull, his cast, his eye dominance, his preferred cartridge, the specific cover he shot over, the specific game he pursued. The measurement session, the trial stock, the pattern test. These were not sales theatre. They were engineering inputs. Purdey understood this before he had his own address. In 1814, at the age of 30, he left Manton's employ and established his own business at 4 Princes Street, Leicester Square. The initial capital was modest. Records of the period suggest the business was capitalized at a figure close to £200, raised partly against his tools and partly on the strength of his reputation within the trade. He employed, by most accounts, no more than 4 craftsmen in the first year. The premises were not large. The ambition was. The gap he had identified was specific. The London trade in 1814 was capable of producing guns of extraordinary quality, but that quality was inconsistent, dependent on the individual craftsman's judgment at each stage of production, and available at prices that placed the finest work beyond all but the wealthiest patrons. What Purdey saw, what 15 years under Hutchinson and Manton had taught him to see, was that the disciplines of barrel fitting, actioning, stocking, and finishing could be held to a single measurable standard across every gun that left the workshop, without sacrificing the bespoke specification that defined the London best gun. He had fitted enough actions to understand where the failures lived. He had stocked enough guns to know when a piece of walnut was wrong before the checkering began. That knowledge was not written down. It was in his hands, and he intended to build a business around the fact that it was. The English best gun, in the early decades of the 19th century, was a flintlock, a mechanism of spring-loaded flint, steel frizzen, and priming pan. Elegant in its way, but sensitive to weather, slow to ignite, and dependent on the shooter's patience in conditions that rarely offered it. A driven grouse in a Scottish downpour did not wait for a damp flint to spark. The percussion system changed everything. The principle had been established by Alexander Forsyth, a minister from Belhelvie, Aberdeenshire, whose 1807 patent on fulminate ignition rendered the flintlock mechanically obsolete almost overnight. The percussion cap, developed through the 1820s, replaced the flint and pan with a small copper cap filled with fulminate compound, seated on a hollow nipple above the touch hole. Strike the cap with a falling hammer, and ignition was instantaneous, weatherproof, and reliable in conditions that had previously defeated the finest flintlock in the trade. Purdey adopted percussion technology early and adapted it precisely. He did not merely convert existing flintlock actions. He rebuilt his production around the new ignition system from the mechanism outward, refining the hammer geometry, the nipple placement, and the lock timing to produce a percussion sporting gun whose ignition characteristics no London competitor had yet matched. But the percussion sporting gun, however refined, was not the achievement that fixed the Purdey name permanently at the apex of the London trade. That achievement came in 1863, in the final months of the founder's life, when his son James the Younger, then 35 years old and already managing the day-to-day direction of the South Audley Street works, filed a patent for a self-opening side-lock ejector action that would become the mechanical foundation of the Purdey side-by-side as it is known today. The side-lock action, as distinct from the box lock, positions the lock mechanism on individual plates set into the side of the stock, behind the action body. Each lock plate carries its own mainspring, tumbler, and sear, entirely independent of the other barrel's mechanism. The result is a trigger pull of exceptional consistency and a lock time, the interval between trigger release and striker fall, shorter than any comparable action in production. For a shooter tracking a driven bird at 40 yards on a November sky, lock time is not an abstraction. It is the difference between the pattern arriving where the bird was and arriving where the bird is. The self-opening feature compounded the advantage. On breaking the gun, pivoting the barrels downward on the hinge at the standing breech to expose the chambers, the Purdey action's mainspring energy, stored during firing, assists the opening movement automatically. The gun opens in the hand without effort. Spent cases are ejected clear. Fresh cartridges are loaded. The gun closes. The entire sequence, in the hands of a practiced shot, required under 4 seconds. At 35 shillings per action component in the trade of the early 1860s, the Purdey self-opener commanded a premium above every competitor in the London market. A completed best quality side-by-side from South Audley Street in 1865 was priced at approximately £35 to £50 against a skilled London craftsman's weekly wage of roughly 12 shillings. The gun represented, at minimum, 2.5 years of a craftsman's earnings. The men who bought them did not consider the price. They considered the waiting list. The route to market required no advertising in the conventional sense. The Army and Navy Store's catalogue carried Purdey's name. The Burlington arcade dealers knew the address, but the primary channel was the one the London best gun trade had always used. Word carried between shooting estates, between officers' messes, between the members of the great driven shoots on the Scottish grouse moors and the Norfolk partridge coverts. A Purdey, seen in the hands of a respected shot on a driven day at Sandringham, was worth more than any trade advertisement. The royal warrant of appointment formalized what the shooting community already knew. Purdey held warrants from successive sovereigns: Queen Victoria, King Edward VII, King George V. Each warrant a public declaration that the royal household had selected Purdey as its gunmaker of choice. The warrant was not an honorary title. It was an engineering endorsement, issued after the household's own gamekeepers and equerries had used the guns in the field and found them satisfactory. In an era when royal association was the most powerful commercial credential available to a British manufacturer, the warrant's value was structural. It was not a decoration, it was the moat. By 1880, the South Audley Street Order Book carried commissions from the Prince of Wales, the Maharaja of Patiala, the Duke of Westminster, and the Cape-Mounted Rifles Officer Corps. Each commission built to individual specification. Each gun bearing the London Proof House mark from Commercial Road, Whitechapel, the stamp of the Worshipful Company of Gunmakers, in continuous operation since 1637. The legal guarantee that every barrel submitted had survived a proof charge exceeding maximum working pressure by the required margin, and that every barrel bearing the mark was safe to fire. The proof mark was not a formality, it was a promise. And on every Purdey that left South Audley Street, it was kept. By the turn of the 20th century, James Purdey Sons occupied a position in the London gun trade that no competitor could honestly claim to share. Not Holland and Holland, whose Bruton Street premises produced guns of comparable mechanical quality but lacked the continuous royal patronage that Purdey had accumulated across 3 successive reigns. Not Boss and Company, whose single-trigger over and under was a mechanical achievement of the first order but whose commercial reach remained narrow. Not Grant, not Woodward, not Atkin, names of genuine distinction in the London trade, every one of them, but names that occupied the second tier of a hierarchy, whose summit Purdey had claimed and held for the better part of 50 years. The South Audley Street premises, expanded and refitted through the 1880s and 1890s, employed approximately 50 craftsmen by 1900. Each occupying a defined role in the production sequence that had not changed in its essential character since the founder's time. The barrel maker drew and bored the tubes. The actioner fitted the lock plates and timed the sears. The stocker inlet the action and shaped the walnut to the customer's measured dimensions. The finisher polished, case hardened, and regulated. The engraver, if the commission specified decoration, worked last, cutting the scroll work into the hardened action body with a precision that no mechanical process has since replicated. A single best quality side lock side by side required, by the company's own account, upward of 850 hours of skilled hand labor across a production sequence spanning 12 to 18 months. 850 hours. In an age when the BSA Small Heath Works was producing Lee Enfield rifle components at a rate measured in thousands per week on purpose-built capstan lathes, Purdey's craftsmen were still fitting lock springs by feel, still checking barrel regulation by firing at marked paper at 25 yards, still adjusting trigger weights by thousandths of an inch with files no wider than a finger. This was not inefficiency. It was a refusal to accept that any mechanical process could make the judgments that a trained hand made automatically. The customer list of the Edwardian Peak reads as a register of global power. King Edward VII himself, for whom Purdey built a matched pair of 12-bore side lock ejectors that remained in royal use through 3 subsequent reigns. The Nizam of Hyderabad, whose commission in 1903 specified Damascus-barreled guns with full coverage scroll engraving, an order that occupied Purdey's engravers for the better part of 8 months. The Duke of Portland, whose Welbeck Abbey shoot required matched pairs capable of handling the volume of driven pheasant that a well-managed Nottinghamshire estate could produce on a November day. The Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, who ordered through the Army and Navy Stores Agency in Calcutta and received his guns via Bombay. The officers of the Household Cavalry, who regarded a Purdey game gun as the natural complement to a commission and a set of rooms in Albany. Then August 1914 arrived, and the driven shoots stopped. The Great War did not ask the London gun trade for its opinion. Within weeks of the declaration, the War Office mobilization orders reached South Audley Street. The bespoke sporting commissions were suspended. The walnut stocks in progress were set aside. The craftsmen who remained, those not already enlisting, those above military age or in reserved occupations, were redirected to precision component work in support of the military contract system. The specific nature of Purdey's wartime production remains only partially documented, but records of the period confirm that the workshop's precision actioning and fitting capabilities were directed toward components requiring tolerances that standard munitions production could not achieve. What is documented is what the workshop lost. Of the craftsmen who left South Audley Street between August 1914 and November 1918, a significant number did not return. Some were killed in France and Flanders. Some returned changed in ways that made the patient, precise, silent work of lock-fitting no longer possible. The apprenticeship pipeline, the 7-year formation of a trained London gun trade craftsman, had been broken at both ends simultaneously. No new apprentices entered during the war years, and the masters who would have trained them were either absent or diminished. Consider what that meant in practical terms. A Purdey actioner in 1914 carried knowledge that could not be written in a manual, could not be photographed, could not be transferred by instruction alone. He knew the precise pressure required to seat a mainspring without stressing the swivel, the exact angle at which a sear nose needed to be stoned to produce a trigger pull of 4 pounds without creep. He knew it in his fingertips. When he did not come back from the Somme, that knowledge did not come back with him. If a Purdey sidelock action left the workshop with a mainspring fitted under insufficient tension, not enough to fail proof, not enough to produce a misfire in dry conditions, but marginal. A shooter standing in a November butt on a driven pheasant day, working a gun at the rate of 300 cartridges between the morning and afternoon drives, might find the second barrel beginning to show ignition hesitation by mid-afternoon. In a commission priced at £50 and warranted to a royal household, that hesitation was not acceptable. It was not a mechanical failure. It was a failure of the hand that fitted the spring. Every craftsman Purdey lost in the war years was an irreplaceable calibration instrument. The workshop survived. The workforce did not survive intact. The armistice of November 1918 brought the sporting commissions back, tentatively at first, then with gathering momentum as the Edwardian shooting culture reasserted itself through the 1920s, adjusted for the losses of the officer class that had sustained it. The order book refilled. The South Audley Street premises reopened to civilian clients. New craftsmen were trained, slowly, imperfectly, against the knowledge that the men who should have trained them were buried in France. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Purdey produced at a rate that kept the waiting list perpetually extended. The interwar years brought refinements rather than revolutions. Improvements to the self-opening mechanism's spring geometry, adjustments to stock dimensions reflecting the shift from black powder to nitro-proof cartridges, the introduction of single-trigger options for clients whose shooting style preferred it. The guns were, if anything, better than they had been before the war. The trade around them was not. Holland and Holland had survived, but contracted. Boss had reduced to skeleton staff. Woodward, whose over and under action was, by the consensus of the London trade, the finest mechanical achievement in British shotgun history, was struggling commercially in ways that the quality of the product alone could not resolve. The ecosystem of the London best gun trade, which had sustained Purdey's craftsman supply chain through 2 generations, was visibly thinning. Then September 1939 arrived, and the German Luftwaffe, on the night of the 16th of April 1940, dropped a bomb on South Audley Street. The premises were damaged. Production was interrupted. The workforce was dispersed across wartime directed labor programs. The order books, the physical records of commissions in progress, measurements taken, stocks selected, actions begun, were partially lost. When the war ended in 1945, Purdey rebuilt. The South Audley Street address was restored. The order book reopened. The craftsmen who remained returned to their benches. But the London gun trade that emerged from the Second World War was a diminished thing. Not in quality, the guns Purdey produced in 1950 were the equal of any the workshop had made in 1910. In scale, in craftsman supply, in the economic substrate that had sustained the best gun trade through its Edwardian peak. The aristocratic driven-shoot culture that had placed a Purdey in every respectable gun cabinet, from Inverness to Nairobi, was adjusting to death duties, agricultural reform, and the managed retreat of the landed estate. The Indian Army Officer Corps, the colonial administration, the vice-regal household, the imperial customer base that had sustained the London trade's export dimension, was dissolving with the empire itself. Purdey adapted. The American market, wealthy, increasingly interested in English sporting guns as objects of cultural as well as mechanical distinction, began to replace the lost imperial customer. The Middle Eastern royal households, newly enriched by petroleum revenues, commissioned pairs and matched sets with specifications that exceeded anything the Edwardian order book had carried. The guns went east, the guns went west, the waiting list stayed long. And through it all, on South Audley Street, a lock filer sat at his bench, a spring in one hand and a stone in the other, doing what his predecessor had done in 1880, and doing it to the same standard. The end of the Purdey story as a wholly British enterprise did not arrive with a single catastrophic event. It arrived the way most endings arrive in British industrial history, incrementally, structurally, and with the appearance, at each individual stage, of being entirely reasonable. The first force was economic. The post-war British economy was not hospitable to luxury craft production. The Labour government's taxation policy of the late 1940s, death duties running to 80% on large estates, income tax at standard rates that compressed disposable income across the upper middle class, systematically dismantled the financial substrate of the driven-shoot culture that had sustained Purdey's domestic order book for a century. The great shooting estates did not disappear overnight, but they reduced. They sold off acreage. They let the keeper's cottage fall empty. They stopped replacing the dogs. A customer base that had once renewed itself generationally, father commissioning a pair, son inheriting them and commissioning his own at 30, began to thin in ways that the American and Middle Eastern replacement market only partially compensated. The second force was the craft pipeline. By 1960, the London gun trade's apprenticeship system was in structural collapse. The number of young men entering training as London-qualified actioners, stockers, and barrel makers had fallen to a fraction of its pre-war level. The causes were multiple and compounding. The relative decline of manufacturing wages compared to service sector employment, the cultural shift away from trade apprenticeships among the post-war generation, and, most critically, the loss of the master craftsmen who should have been training the next cohort but had not survived long enough to do so. Purdey recognized the problem earlier than most. The company invested in internal training in ways that no other surviving London maker could sustain financially. Craftsmen were brought through longer apprenticeships, held at higher wages, retained through conditions designed to prevent the knowledge from walking out of the door with the individual who carried it. It was not enough to rebuild what had been lost. It was enough to preserve what remained. The third force was the market itself, and here the numbers are unsparing. In 1900, the London best gun trade produced, across all its surviving makers, an estimated 2,000 to 2,500 best quality guns per year. By 1960, that figure had contracted to fewer than 400 across the entire trade. By 1980, Purdey alone accounted for a significant proportion of total London best gun output. Not because Purdey had grown, but because the trade around it had contracted to near extinction. Boss and Company had reduced to one craftsman working part-time on restoration. Woodward had been absorbed by Purdey itself in 1949. The greatest single trigger over and under action in British gun-making history, acquired not as a triumph but as a rescue, The Woodward family unable to sustain production independently through the post-war austerity years. Grant, Atkin, Lang. Names that had occupied South Audley Street and St. James's Street through the Edwardian peak. Gone, or contracting toward invisibility, one by one through the 1950s and 1960s. Purdey absorbed what it could. It could not absorb everything. The fourth force arrived in 1994. By the early 1990s, the economics of sustaining a bespoke hand production workshop at South Audley Street with craftsmen on London wages, walnuts sourced from European forests at premium prices, a production sequence requiring 850 hours of skilled labor per gun, and a waiting list that generated revenue 3 years after the commission was accepted, had reached a point that no conventional business structure could sustain indefinitely. The Purdey family, in continuous involvement with the company through 5 generations from 1814, had navigated post-war austerity, the collapse of the imperial market, the contraction of the London trade, and the craft knowledge crisis. What they could not navigate indefinitely was the capital requirement of sustaining a manufacturing operation whose cost structure was structurally incompatible with conventional return on investment. The Richemont Group, the Swiss luxury conglomerate whose portfolio included Cartier, IWC Schaffhausen, and Montblanc, acquired James Purdey Sons in 1994. The price was not disclosed publicly. The terms preserved the South Audley Street address, the existing workforce, and the production methodology without alteration. Richemont did not acquire Purdey in order to change it. They acquired it in order to own the thing that cannot be manufactured by any process faster than 850 hours of hand labor, cannot be replicated by any factory in any country, and cannot be substituted by any product in any adjacent category. They acquired it, in other words, as the thing it had always been. But the question of ownership is not merely commercial. It is constitutional, in the sense that a craft tradition is constitutional. It belongs to the culture that produced it, or it belongs to whoever holds the deed. In 1994, the deed passed to Geneva. The craftsman did not notice on Monday morning. The lock filer sat at his bench. The stocker inlet his action. The engraver cut his scroll work. The name above the door was the same. The answer to the question of who owns it was not. The fifth force was silence. The slow, unmeasured loss of the makers who surrounded Purdey and gave the London best gun trade its collective identity. Without boss. Without Woodward as an independent entity. Without Grant or Lang or the dozen smaller makers who had occupied the margins of the trade and trained the craftsmen who eventually found their way to South Audley Street, Purdey stood increasingly alone. Not closed, not failed, not wound up, simply alone. The last independent London best gunmaker of the first rank, surrounded by the addresses where the others had been. The order book stayed open. The waiting list stayed long. The proof marks kept coming from Commercial Road, Whitechapel, each barrel tested, each stamp pressed into the steel, the worshipful company of gunmakers, discharging in the 21st century the same obligation it had discharged since 1637. The capstan lathes went cold at Enfield. The small heath works fell quiet. The gun quarter in Birmingham contracted to a fraction of its Victorian footprint. The barrel borers retired. The lock filers did not find apprentices. Purdey survived. The world it had been built inside did not. James Purdey Sons did not close. That fact alone, in the context of what happened to the London best gun, is the most extraordinary thing about the company's history. More extraordinary than any royal warrant, any Edwardian commission, any wartime conversion. In an industry where names that had stood for a century dissolved quietly into receivership or silence, Purdey endured. The workshop on South Audley Street is open today. The order book is full. The waiting list runs to several years for a new commission. A best quality sidelock side by side, built to the customer's individual specification by craftsmen trained in the same tradition as their predecessors of 1880, is priced at figures exceeding £100,000 for a single gun, and significantly more for a matched pair. The market that sustains those prices is not the market that built the company. The Edwardian aristocrat, the vice-regal officer, the Maharaja placing his commission through the Calcutta agency, these customers are gone. What replaced them is a global constituency of collectors, serious sporting shots, and individuals for whom the Purdey side-by-side represents something that no other manufactured object in the world provides. A functional instrument of absolute precision, built entirely by hand, to a specification that has not been meaningfully altered since the self-opening side-lock action was patented in the 1860s, bearing proof marks from the oldest proof authority in the world and capable of outlasting every person involved in its production by a margin of centuries. That is not a marketing claim. It is a mechanical reality. A Purdey side-by-side, built in 1895 and properly maintained, will pattern as consistently today as it did on the first driven day it attended. The steel does not forget. The geometry does not drift. A gun timed correctly on the South Audley Street bench in the final decade of the 19th century is timed correctly still because the lock filer who timed it understood that the work he was doing would outlast him by a distance he could not calculate, and he worked accordingly. The collector market reflects this with the clarity that only sustained demand can produce. Original Victorian and Edwardian Purdey side-by-sides, particularly matched pairs in original proof, with original cases and accessories, appear regularly at Bonhams and Holt's, the principal British auction houses for quality sporting arms, where documented examples in fine condition achieve five-figure sums and exceptional pairs considerably more. The historical Breech-Loading Small Arms Association maintains the reference community for serious British gun collectors, and within that community, a first-quality Purdey from the golden years of the Edwardian workshop is not merely a collectible. It is a primary source, physical evidence of what the London trade could produce at its absolute peak. The Royal Armouries at Leeds and the National Firearms Centre at Nottingham, the Pattern Room collection, hold examples that document the production sequence across Purdey's history. The Imperial War Museum's collection includes pieces that pass through the wartime period. For the researcher, the provenance chain of a documented Purdey is among the most traceable in British gun making. The order books survive, the customer records survive. The measurement cards survive. A gun can be matched to the commissioner, the date, the craftsman responsible for the actioning, the proof submission date, the delivery record. 850 hours of labor, fully documented across 150 years of surviving archive. There is a detail that does not appear in the company's official history, and that only surfaces in the private correspondence of the Purdey family, held at the London Metropolitan Archives. A philanthropic endowment, established quietly by James the Younger in the 1880s, providing annual payments to the widows of London gun trade craftsmen who had died in service. No public announcement, no trade press notice. The payments continued under family administration into the 1920s. The names of the recipients were never published. The endowment was wound up without ceremony when the last qualifying widow died. It appears in no account of the company's history that has been widely circulated. The men whose hands built the reputation were remembered, privately, by the family whose name the reputation carried. What does the Ark of Purdey represent, considered as a whole? It represents the extreme outer limit of what British craft manufacturing could sustain under the pressures of the 20th century. Legislative, economic, demographic, and imperial. Every other maker of comparable ambition in the London best gun trade failed to survive intact. Purdey survived, but the survival required the transfer of ownership to a continental luxury group with the capital structure to absorb the economics of 850-hour production cycles at London wages. The craft was preserved, the ownership was not. That is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. The guns are still made. The standard is still held. The proof marks still come from Commercial Road, Whitechapel. But it raises a question that British industrial culture has never satisfactorily answered. At what point does the preservation of a craft tradition by foreign capital constitute rescue, and at what point does it constitute acquisition of something that a nation produced over 2 centuries and could not in the end afford to keep? The answer, if there is one, is locked in an action body on South Audley Street. Hand-fitted, hand-timed, bearing the proof mark of the Worshipful Company of Gunmakers and the name of a Marylebone gunmaker's son, who walked out of Joseph Manton's workshop in 1814 with nothing but his hands, his knowledge, and his conviction that the finest shotgun ever made had not yet been built, still opening smoothly at the standing breech, still ejecting clean, still regulated to pattern at 30 yards on a November sky, exactly as the lock filer on the South Audley Street bench intended 140 years ago, when he stoned the seer nose to 4 pounds and set the spring and knew, without being told, that the work would outlast him, music. Every week, we find the stories that were never stamped alongside the proof mark. If this one mattered to you, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.